So all I have today is I just have a basic sketchbook. In fact, this is a pretty cheap sketchbook. It's like a $3 sketchbook. So my paper is not anything fancy today, but you could use any kind of paper you have. This could even be printer paper. And I just even have just a basic pencil. I do have some actual drawing pencils with some different graphite types, like 4B and 2B. These are a little bit darker, but we don't really need to get into that today so much. I just want to keep it nice and simple with just kind of paper and pencil. And really kind of my goal today is to start talking about some drawing basics from going more 2-dimensional to 3-dimensional. So I'm going to kind of on this page take some like, or write down some like notes style things that if you want to jot down as well, feel free. But if you want to kind of wait till we get to the actual drawing portion, you know, whatever works best for you is totally fine for me. So I just call this, the name of this class is 2D to 3D, and we're focusing on drawing forms. I will also, when I'm finished with this class, I will make sure to take a nice picture of like my notes and post them too, so you can see them and have access to that after the fact as well. So thinking about shape, you know, just kind of draw some basic shapes. So when we're thinking about shape, I'm talking about things like circles, triangles, squares, you know, rectangles, those types of things. Okay, those are shapes. Things we know about shape. Shape is 2-dimensional, right? So shape is 2-dimensional, meaning it's flat and it only has height and width. So height and width. So these are kind of our properties of shape. So if you look at lots of paintings, drawing, you're going to see lots of shape. You know, if you know who Matisse is, think about Matisse or even Picasso. You're seeing a lot of shape. It's flatter. It tends to not be as realistic. It tends to be stylized. And it's a great way to draw. But a lot of people are wondering, well, how do I draw more realistically? And even if it's a stylized version of reality, they're wanting to learn, how do I do that? So we're going to take a look at how we turn shape into form. So kind of taking a look at basic forms from these shapes. Okay, so we have a sphere, but of course, drawing a sphere we can't do unless we have value, which we'll talk more about in a minute, but just for kind of illustrative purposes. Okay, we'll do something like this. Okay, so thinking like not a circle anymore, but like a ball. Okay. If we think about like a triangle, perhaps we could think about a pyramid, or also a cone where it's rounded on the bottom. You could also see it from this direction. A cone could go this way as well. Okay. We could take a look at boxes or cubes or rectangular prisms. Okay. So now we're taking a look at form. So we've transformed this a little bit. Now we're looking at something that's 3D. It's not flat anymore. It's, I kind of refer to it as in the round. Is a good way to think of it. So it's in the round. And we still have height and width, but we've also added depth. Okay, so we're seeing that depth. Now we're starting to see space. And when we can see space in art, we can translate that into real life, and it starts to look more realistic to us. It starts to make sense. Because no matter what, a painting or drawing is always flat, right? It's always flat. It's never actually 3D like a sculpture would be. But we can create an illusion of space through form, thus creating something that looks more realistic. So something to consider, I mean, you might want to think about, you know, creating space or perhaps the illusion of space. And that's what we're doing in drawing and painting, okay? And I really, when I'm teaching drawing and painting to even my high school students, I really start here, even with painting, because it's really the foundation of it. And if you're wanting to paint more realistically, this is very helpful as well. And it's just a different approach. So we tend to think form is how we get a little bit more realistic. So I touched on this a second ago, but one other component that we need is value. Okay, so value is, simply put, the range from light to dark or dark to light. But this, in conjunction with form, really helps us create that sense of space. Because when we're looking, let's say we're driving down the road, and in front of us, there is a mountain, okay? And as we're driving down that road, we can see different lights and darks on that mountain or whatever we're looking at. There's shadows. If we're taking a walk down the sidewalk and we notice trees and bushes along the path, they cast shadows along the sidewalk. And sometimes those shadows are really interesting to look at. But it's just important to note that light plays a very, very, very important role in creating an illusion of space, thus drawing more realistically. Okay. So I'm just gonna kind of divide up my space a little bit, because this is kind of our basic kind of idea today, our notes. So we're just going to do a little kind of practice exercise a little bit, just to get comfortable drawing the forms. So let's go ahead and just start with a cube. So the easiest way to draw a cube, I think, and perhaps you maybe already feel comfortable, but I just start with a square. And if it ends up being more rectangle or ends up looking more like a box or rectangular prism versus a cube, totally fine. I just usually roll with that if that ends up happening when I'm drawing this way. So then I just bring out some lines. Parallel lines is the key here. We want to make sure they're parallel. And eventually, you know, if you want to draw with a ruler to make sure they're really straight, you can. But usually when I'm practicing this way, I freehand it. I don't worry about the perfection so much right away. Clean that up a little bit. And then all we need to do is just close this off to make our box or our cube. And again, if it's not looking like a box or cube, just kind of double check your lines and make sure each one has a buddy. That's why I always tell my students, each one needs just a parallel buddy. And so if one doesn't look right, maybe it's kind of off, you just need to make sure it's parallel. So kind of some of those little tricks help. So we're going to take a look at how to add value to a cube, and then we'll look at how to add value to a sphere. And the reason we'll do those two is because there's two different methods. A cube is very easy because it's sectioned for us. We automatically have these separated planes, okay? So when you're thinking of a cube, think about real life objects that you could translate this into. It could be a building. It could become like a stove. You could draw like a back on it and put your burners on it with your oven door, right? You could maybe crop areas and it could become a table. So in your mind, you start thinking, what could I do with this form to turn it into something else? But in order to do that, before we turn it into something, we need to understand how light hits something that's sectioned and how we shade something like that. So just for purposes of just kind of this demonstration, I'm just going to put this on like a little table, like it's sitting on a tabletop. So I'm just going to draw two little horizontal lines coming out from either end. And then just for my own reference, I'm going to draw like a little, one of those little suns to just illustrate this is where my sun is. This is where the light is shining from. Okay, you could even draw an arrow if this is helpful for you in the beginning. But you're thinking, okay, the sun is coming from here. This is where my light is coming from. And different times of day, that light will shift as the sun moves. So this is just, we're making this up. Now, let's say you took a photograph of a building that you wanted to draw. You might actually notice where that light source is coming from in that photo. But when you're making it up, you get to decide. So for a sectioned cube, we actually don't really need to do anything to the top because this is what's referred to as a highlight. Okay, so a highlight means the lightest part because the light is closest to it. Okay, then we're just going to kind of step away. As we move further away from the light, it gradually gets darker. So you could consider a highlight is a 0. Now next we have this one. This is what you'd refer to as a mid-tone, or we can call this a 1. And then maybe just gonna do some just light hatching, just not a ton of pressure with my pencil. I'm not worrying if it's perfectly smooth. This is just kind of to illustrate value on a form. Okay, so something like that. You could even do a little cross hatch if you wanted to, if you like the look of that. And you could cross this too. So we've got a highlight and then we've got a mid-tone. So then as we move here, this is what's referred to as like your core shadow. So on the actual object itself, it's the darkest part. So we'll call this number 2. And this, I'm just gonna press a little bit harder pressure-wise with my pencil, so it's a little bit darker than my mid-tone. All right, so now I'm looking at a cube or a box, and I've got my different sections of value. So now in my mind, I can start to see that space even more so. Now, of course, this isn't super realistic, but as you learn to draw more this way, things tend to look more realistic, thus creating that illusion of space too. So there's a couple more things we have to do before we're done. So we know if on a bright sunny day, if there's an object, we know that there is going to be a cast shadow. So I will draw, because I'm doing a cube, it will just be in the shape of the cube. So I'll draw 2 lines coming out and just close that off. And this is my shadow, or sorry, my cast shadow, because it's being cast on the surface. Cast shadow. And this would be 3. So my cast shadow is actually even darker than my core shadow. So even with some more pressure, I go ahead and fill that in. There we go. So those are kind of the basic components. Now there's one last thing that happens. When a shadow is cast, there's actually a bit of light that bounces back up onto the object itself, not the cast shadow, but the object. So I usually just take my eraser on the back of my pencil, and I'll just erase just a teensy little strip at the bottom of the box on the cast shadow side. And this is referred to as reflected light. And as far as like the tone of like, it's like a 0 again. So I'll just go ahead and put 0 so you know it matches the highlight. It's that same lightness. Now, some people, if you're getting familiar with value, we only have really 4 values here, including white. So we have our white, value 1, value 2, value 3. That's not too complicated. As you start to add more values, it gets more complicated. So sometimes it can be helpful to draw yourself a little value scale. You can do like a little strip like this, and because it would be segmented, you could just draw yourself some little segments and go as far as you want to. But then what you can do is just practice making your pencil darker just with pressure. And see how many ranges you can get just with, like, this would be an HB pencil. So you'll be able to get quite a few values just with an HB pencil, but when you start to add in, this is a 2B pencil, when you start to add in a 2B, I can start to go even darker. And then when I add in a 4B, I can go even darker yet. Okay, so adding other pencils will increase the amount of values you can create. But when you're starting out, a regular pencil like a number 2, HB, those yellow pencils will produce at least 5 values for you to do something like this. Okay, so this is a segmented one. I'm just going to go ahead and flip to my next page so I'm not taking up feet clearly. And let's go ahead and we'll do a sphere. So the idea is the same, but the way you shade it is different, because the cube, like I said, we have those segments, it's segmented with the different sides. So it's pretty easy to shade something like that. A sphere is a little bit different, and a sphere is the same way you'd shade like a cylinder or a cone, where it's a more blended, gradual, or tonal type of shading. So just to change it up, I'll go ahead and put my sun on the other side here, just to get comfortable having it different places. So if my sun is here, I know, and we'll just draw some little pencil lines so you can just kind of see loosely where things will go. So if my sun's here, I can kind of draw, I almost kind of mimic that same curve. This is going to be my highlight. Okay. And then as I move down away from that light source, maybe I've got another one through here. Again, I'm following that curve. This is going to be my midtone. And if it's helpful, we can put those numbers. Sometimes that's helpful, just thinking about your values when you're just starting. So we have a highlight, we have a midtone, and then when I go down here to this section, this will be that core shadow, the darkest part of my form. So we'll call that a 2. Okay, and then as far as your cast shadow, basically a cast shadow, if you just kind of follow that arrow, a cast shadow just goes in the direction that the sun comes from. And it's just kind of an elongated oval shape usually. And depending on how intense the sun is, it's going to change. So this would be my cast shadow. And this would be a 3. And then of course we will have that bit of reflected light, but I wait till the end to put that in, just because I think it's easier to erase it than to save space for it. But you know, you could, if you want, make yourself a little section for that reflected light. It's just personal preference, to be honest. So when you're starting to shade something like this, we're going to do something called cross-hatching. So cross-hatching is where you shade in one direction, a second direction, a third direction, a fourth, and then a fifth. And if you do this on your paper and look in the middle of that where all those lines intersected, it's going to look pretty blended without you having to smudge it or use a blending stick or anything like that. You can actually blend just with your graphite through cross-hatching. And you don't have to, like I did on this one, I did a little cross-hatching and I purposefully left it so you could see that hatching. but if you layer it enough times, it will blend and you will no longer see those lines. So what I start doing is right kind of on this edge. So let's go ahead and try. Let's do this. That'll be easier. So what I'll start doing from here is I'll just start putting in some hatch lines. And notice kind of the direction of my lines. I'm not going, you know, this way to flatten it. I'm purposely starting out kind of mimicking the shape of the sphere. That's how I'm going to begin. Now you can make this, you can shade as realistically or as stylized as you want. Some people like to stipple and do little dots. Some people shade just by scribbling. I mean, really, you can have, oops, I didn't show it. It's not on the screen, I'm sorry. Here's the stippling, here's the scribbling. So it's like you can play around with what your pencil's doing a little bit, depending on how realistic or how stylized you want this to be. The principles are the same though. So then from here, I just kind of start going this way. And again, I'm just moving my pencil to just kind of go along with that natural shape of the sphere. And just letting all those lines intersect. And I mean, it is a little bit of a process. I am kind of going quicker for the sake of a demonstration. But if I was truly going to sit down and shade this, I might spend an hour just shading really nice forms. So, you know, this is kind of more or less a quick overview. So you have some of those skills that you can practice this on your own as well. But let's go ahead and just, we'll kind of finish this out and we'll look at some of the transition as well. So what you'll start doing is you'll start bringing down that initial mid-tone. But then you can start increasing your pressure of your pencil. So this is where you can just play around with pencil. And as you cross hatch in between these sections, you're going to naturally create a nice blend or fade between the values. It's just naturally going to happen. Now, I tend to be a very sketchy drawer. That's just how I like to draw. I like to see pencil lines. I like to know it's graphite. I don't necessarily draw hyper realistic. So I purposefully like to move my pencil in lots of little directions as I build up my layers. You might not want to do that. You might want to be very directional and intentional depending on your style. You know, I could also clean this up a little bit. It's a little egg-shaped. There we go, that looks a little bit better. Okay, and then as I bring this down, again, I'm just gonna continue to get darker and darker with my pressure. Again, if you have drawing pencils, like I mentioned, those B pencils, the 2B, the 4B, 6B, that can help with that progression of the value. All right, so then I can leave a little bit of that reflected light. I'm gonna label that too. Or I could erase it, like I said, whichever one is best. It's a 0. And finish out this. Now, we notice that it kind of goes white to gray, bam, all sudden. So one thing we can do, a couple things. One, you can use your eraser to just kind of naturally lighten that a little bit. I don't have one sitting out here, but if you have a kneaded eraser or know what that is, it almost looks like a little piece of poster putty. Those are really good for this kind of thing too. But sometimes, yeah, you're gonna have to go back in a little bit and work on that blend, that transition. That just kind of comes with time. You can also take your pencil a little bit and kind of build up that transition so it's not so jarring, so sudden. So those are just some kind of little tips you can do. And then as you get down here to that cast shadow, just keep in mind that's the darkest part of the entire thing. So don't be afraid to just get in there right away with some heavy pressure. And then you can start layering your pencil and doing your cross hatching if you're choosing to cross hatch. Now, one thing I want to point out too is when I draw on white paper and I don't have any type of background, this line right here prevents it from looking realistic. So one thing you can do is you can actually shade backgrounds up to that point too. And you could also put a color in here. But when you get rid of that line, then things start to look even more realistic, okay? I always explain to students, like if you watch cartoons or look at illustrations, they oftentimes have black outlines. But us in real life, we don't have black outlines. We don't see flowers with black outlines or trees with outlines. They just are there. So creating something like this and bringing it up to your edge or that line can create a more realistic feel as well when you're drawing. So the next thing, I'm gonna just pop this back out a minute, just to make sure you can see everything. Just draw a little line here. And I will mention too, if you do want to practice like a blended value scale, you can do that too. You could draw yourself like a little box and just kind of start really light pressure and then just start building your pressure this way. And this is a good way to practice like your more blended transitions if you're wanting to practice those, whereas the other one we drew like the little segments. So blended versus segmented. Anything you shade is going to be one or the other or a combo of both. So any object you want to draw. So the next thing I just want to mention, and then we can put together a couple little things. We have a little bit of time left, is form manipulation. So we can manipulate our forms. And we can also combine forms. So it doesn't have to be just one single object, but it could be a grouping of them together. So for example, I could have a cube, a box. Okay, so we know here's our basic form that we know is our basic cube, but perhaps maybe I want to see through it. So I could add in, or like you could call it like you're splicing through something. So maybe it goes all the way through and I can now see through it. Maybe same thing on this side. I want to be able to see through it. So I can start adding things now to kind of manipulate these forms in conjunction with my value to then start creating actual objects, actual things. Perhaps, I don't know, this could be like a birdhouse maybe. I could have it be sitting on like a pole. Maybe it's on a cylinder pole. And you think about what that bottom would look like. You could have ground. Maybe I'd have it come from back there a little bit more, but that's okay. Maybe you're going to add on like a little roof to this. Then you can start erasing things you're seeing behind. Get that out. There we go. That looks more like a roof. So, you kind of get the idea. You can start to combine some of these things to create new things. Perhaps there's like a vine wrapped around this. So then I can start to create forms that are wrapping or twisting in a sense. And again, it's all forms. It's all, I would then, apply shading in a blended way, just like I did up here. Okay, so we can also manipulate and break things down. So we have a little bit of time left. So what I thought would be fun is just maybe creating just kind of an abstract composition of these 3D forms. So combining as many as we can, and this could be something we kind of start together, and then as class ends, you could kind of wrap up on your own, play on your own, kind of play around with some shading, see what you can come up with, and then you could email me your kind of results or share it with me in a future class. We do have an art share coming up, so you could show it there. It will be a live event, and I'll share some of my art and processes as well with the club. But this is just kind of a great way to practice the concepts we've talked about today. And as I teach future classes, I'm going to start teaching weekly drawing classes where we'll pick an object or an animal or something, and we'll work together to draw it. So this is kind of a foundation for those classes that will be coming up. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start with a sphere. I'm not shading anything right now. I'm just going to be line drawing to start. I'm going to do all my line drawing, then I'll put some shading into it. So my sphere will just look like a circle for now. But I'm going to go ahead and just start with a sphere. That's going to be my starting point. But my goal here is to use forms to create a sense of depth and space on this piece of paper. And we're just starting out with white and a little circle. That's going to become a sphere. So now perhaps maybe I want to draw some cylinders coming out. So what I'm going to do is on this circle is I'm going to draw kind of a little half circle, almost like I'm going to draw a smiley face. Then I'm going to bring these lines up like this, and they're going to start closing in a little bit. Then I'm going to erase this little line right here. You know, and I could play around with that a little bit. It's not totally centered, but yeah, that's okay. And then let's see, this is going to be a cone actually. So I'm going to have it come to like a little point. You know, and then maybe I'll have another cone coming off in the back, but I'm really only seeing it this way. And I could have another one coming down here if I wanted. Then maybe I'll have this kind of be attached to another sphere. It's almost kind of reminding me of like a molecule or something. I don't know. You're like hooking little things together or building with Legos, but you're drawing instead. You know, so whatever, you know, kind of forms interest you, I say draw those ones. You don't have to copy me exactly if you're not, you know, wanting to go the same route. You know, I say this is a starting point and you can take it your own way. Then let's see, maybe we'll do something wrapped on this cone. So I'm just going to have like a cylinder. I'm going to see a little bit of the end of it. So I'm going to take a cylinder and make it into like a wrapped piece around this cone. And again, this is just abstract. So I'm going to see it kind of come around the back. And then if it's helpful, you can erase first, because sometimes drawing this way, and I'll go a little bit closer. Sometimes drawing this way, it does get a little confusing when you're overlapping lines because you do have to do a little erasing. So then I could bring this around here. And I'm just gonna kind of wrap this around a little bit. Just give it a little something extra. Then I can have it go around the back again. And then come back over top. And then I could just kind of repeat that, or maybe I just want this to end right here. You know, maybe there's a cube on the bottom here, perhaps. More of a box. If you want to kind of create even more depth or perspective of space, you could kind of angle in this a little bit. We could even kind of have it go this way. Create some kind of different types of forms. But it's basically just kind of building and creating something. I mean, you could have an object in mind, almost think like, oh, maybe a mechanical bird, or, you know, you could maybe see something if you wanted to. I could have some more cones coming out of here. Oops, there we go, so we can see it. You know, I could have yet another box. Maybe something like that, and I can just kind of keep not drawing too straight today. And maybe this could even be like a little sun, like a 3D sun. I could start drawing cones coming out of it. But, you know, you can just kind of play around and kind of keep combining. Now you could do some of the other manipulation things, like maybe there is an opening through this one, and I can, you know, kind of see through it. So you can kind of play around with how you're adding things too. You know, you could add a ground into this. You could think of it as you're building a little city, you know, kind of whatever you're feeling. Then when you get to a point where you've kind of made something, pick whatever area you want to have your light source coming from, and then challenge yourself to see how much you can shade. For example, if my light is coming down here on this cone, try to focus on one at a time, because sometimes our minds can be like, well, how do I shade this and this and this all at the same time? So breaking it down is helpful. So we know that whatever's lightest will be our highlight, and then we go to a mid-tone, and then we get darker to our core shadow. So even just kind of blocking in, it doesn't even have to be perfectly shaded, but even just kind of blocking in some of the general values can just be really helpful to practice. Like this would be my highlight, then I'd have my mid-tone. This side is furthest away from that light source, so I know it would be my darkest. You know, and perhaps it's easiest to go ahead and shade all your light forms first, because then you'll have that rhythm of shading cone, shading cone, shading cone. Then you can move over and say, okay, this is my cube. Well, this is my highlight, but this is a little bit further away from the sun. So maybe I start to see a little something here, right? And then I know I need to shade this because it's a little bit further away from that light source, and it's further down too because I've created this depth here. So I know it's going to be darker. So it's just kind of playing around, and once you get familiar and comfortable with these concepts, I promise drawing anything you want to draw is going to be so much easier, because it really just trains your eye on how to see form and shape in whatever you want to draw. So the next time you're out on a walk and you're like, oh, that tree's really cool, that would be fun to draw. You don't see it as just the shape of a trunk anymore, but you break it down into a cylinder, and all the branches become stretched out, elongated cylinders. And then you think about the shapes of flowers, the shapes of bugs, and all these different things found in nature can be broken down into these basic forms and then manipulated to create whatever